We're very excited to have today Moses Kusura. He's the laboratory director at the Suffolk County Division of Vector Control on Long Island. And mosquitoes and ticks are a big concern for folks this time of year, and we often get a lot of questions wanting to know, should I spray my yard? What can I do to manage mosquitoes and ticks in my yard? And that is what Moses is going to be talking about today. So thanks for joining us, and go ahead.
Thank you. Appreciate it. All right, so we'll dive right in because we only have 15 minutes, correct? So today we're going to go over tick and mosquito yard treatments, a little bit about each organism because they are vastly different from one another, and what we can do around the home to try to manage them with products that we can find in local stores and with some of the non-pesticide based control methods as well. Just for reference photo here, that's actually, it was about 350 mosquito larvae that came up in a single dipping container, just a little bit smaller than a soda. So you can see the density of mosquitoes you can have within a relatively small breeding container. And for those curious, over here on the left, that is a tick hypostome. That is actually the portion of the tick that they used to feed on the host. Then we have all three stages of the Ixodes scapularis, or the deer tick, with the female on the left, the nymphal stage, and then the adult male. So we're going to jump right onto the tick side of things initially, and the reason why we have a large surplus of ticks within the environment is typically because of a high density of white-tailed deer. White-tailed deer are the primary host that most tick species within the Northeast and in many other parts of the country. That's where the adult stage of the ticks feed on. So they are the ones that allow a high level of reproductive success for the entire tick species. Some of the smaller mammals that ticks feed on, they do have an impact on the population, but generally speaking, the larval and nymphal stages of ticks have a very low level of survival in the environment naturally. So when you're talking about population density and overall population trends, it's almost always driven by the adult reproductive stage. In fact, in most pest populations. But typically when we're talking about the deer, for most areas in the Northeast US, and this is slightly different depending on the ecosystem of the area, if you have over 20 deer per square mile, that's generally too many animals for that acreage. Based on food availability and things like that. And you can see that with that, you have an increased tick density. You have an increased incidence of invasive plants because the level of herbivory is very high. So they tend to wipe out native plants and the invasives move in. It decreases the general biodiversity of the understory, and it can actually reduce the biodiversity of birds and other organisms within that environment as well. Moving on to just enough deer, around that 12 to 15 animals per square mile, you generally see a improvement in native plant regrowth. You generally see a decrease of invasive spread, and you see a normal rate of tick success. So keep in mind, it's very, very difficult to remove ticks from the environment completely, but we can do a pretty good job of reducing densities so that we can go outside and have a little bit more fun not encountering them. And also, when we have too few deer on the site, that can actually cause environmental degradation. So some of your native plants will actually start acting invasively when they don't have the appropriate level of herbivory. So now around our properties, one of the biggest things that we can do to manage ticks of virtually every species is vegetation management. That includes things like keeping your grass mowed relatively short, minimizing how often your sprinkler system comes on, because if you're allowing a relatively humid, moist environment around your home, that'll just allow the ticks to quest for a longer period of time. So with mowing, that opens up the area, allows more wind to come in and dry out the relative humidity. If you do have any trails around your property, if you abut any woodlands or anything like that, pushing that leaf litter away from the edge habitat and widening the trail so you don't encounter the brush as you're moving through it, that helps considerably. If you do live in an area that you have tree canopies overhead, you can open them up to allow more sunlight down into the plots, again, to dry out that relative humidity. And around some of your high use zones, like this bottom photograph that shows a swing set here, this edge habitat, that's where the bulk of your ticks are actually going to move onto your property from. Now, ticks move fairly slowly, but they will migrate from these edge habitat areas into the high use area when they see a potential host. So if you have a mulch barrier, or in this photo, they have a gravel installation, which is a xeric zone or a dry zone, that really minimizes the movement of the ticks from the broader environment onto your high use area. And when you combine this with acaricides or pesticide applications, it can actually improve your control dramatically when you have multiple aspects of control working for you here. So around the home, we just mentioned the high use zones here. So that is basically this edge habitat around the end. If you have a garden, a swing set, a deck, or any other amenities around the home, those are the areas that you want to pay attention to for ticks, especially around the mailbox on the front. A lot of us have vegetation, or in some cases, our mailboxes are actually recessed into a bush at the front of the driveway. So those are the places you need to look out for ticks, or apply some of these products when you are wishing to use acaricides. And another thing to point out, things like wood piles or stone walls, brush piles, any type of vegetation buildup like that, can really lead to an increase of tick density in the area because it attracts small mammals and things like that. So now jumping over to the mosquito side around the home. Virtually anything we have outside our homes, even some things built onto the home that hold water, intentionally or otherwise, will provide breeding grounds for mosquitoes. A big thing around residential properties is actually the gutters, especially if you have a two-story house. If you're not up there checking on these gutters annually, or at least semi-annually, they will often get clogged, hold water, and they can breed thousands and thousands of mosquitoes, which will then descend upon the property. And anything else around the property that holds water, like we mentioned, whether it be the saucers under your potted plants, it can be a bucket or part of a child's toy that tends to hold water that's out in your yard. And this can be anything from a 5-gallon bucket down to a bottle cap that you can see here. Bottle caps themselves, they can allow up to 50 larvae to successfully reproduce in that small amount of water. And depending on the temperature and time of year, you could only be looking at about 5 days from the time the eggs hatch to the time you have an adult mosquito. So this life cycle can take place fairly rapidly. So if you're wanting to manage them, you need to stay on top of any standing water. And some other things around the community based off of mosquitoes. Anytime you see any trash or refuse around your home, around your community, if you're on your walk or taking your dog out or anything like that, just pick it up and properly dispose of it, because that way it won't hold water and potentially lead to mosquito-related issues. If you notice any debris or anything like that on neighbor's property, that's often helpful just to let your neighbors know that it could be a mosquito issue. And actually, a big thing that a lot of people tend to miss is actually bird baths. We know that we want them to generally hold water consistently so the birds can use them, but oftentimes that water is not changed out often enough, so it can turn to a breeding site. And then things like these corrugated downspouts can actually lead to a lot of mosquito breeding inside the ridges, because after all the water comes down your downspout, those ridges hold water after the fact, and it will allow mosquitoes to effectively breed in there. If you do have any spare tires or anything similar in nature to a bucket around the property, like we've mentioned previous, that would be another large area that you could have breeding. Now, talking about pesticide products that we can potentially use, there's generally 3 classifications. There's your traditional synthetic pyrethroids, and they tend to be quick acting. They tend to have a fairly long lasting period of time depending on formulation. They are fairly effective. You can look at ratios well above the 70% control, depending on the formulation and type of application. Unfortunately, there is some negative non-target effects with these products because they are generalist pesticides. But that's something we have to keep in mind for the timing of these applications and where we choose to apply them. Another classification is biopesticides. This can be anything from a fungal agent to actually a bacterial agent. And they tend to be shorter lasting. Their range of effectiveness varies wildly based on the type of biopesticide product it is and the formulation. There is a range of non-target effects. It is scaled again based on the type of product. But again, biopesticides are a generalist pesticide product, so there will be non-target effects. However, they do tend to be lesser than your traditional synthetic pyrethroids. Now, the third classification, which has actually gained a lot of momentum in the market over the last decade or so, is your 25B exempt natural oils. So this is anything that has an active ingredient of, say, rosemary oil or cedar oil, or a slew of other natural oils that are on the appropriate use list from your state. These tend to be very short-lived products. They can have fairly effective knockdowns, again, depending on the formulation that are applied. They can have a decent range of effectiveness, and they are generalist products, so you will have some non-target effects, although generally they are assumed to be limited. And you can find a whole range of products through anything from a hose-based applicator that attaches to a hose to mosquito dunks or other types of products to put in standing water around your property that cannot be drained. And for ticks in particular, there are granular and liquid formulations. So for tick control in particular, the granular and liquid formulations of both the traditional synthetics and the 25B exempt oils can do a very effective job of controlling ticks. The applications need to be made when the ticks are actively questing. So you want to see if you can get a concept of when those ticks are active for your localized area. And you want to do the application around the lower part of the vegetation, on the leaf litter and the lower stems of any plants, as ticks spend more than 2/3 of their time in the leaf litter or just on top of it. That's where you want to do the bulk of your application. So, and again, combining this with any other of the vegetation management strategies we've already discussed will improve the control rate you see on the product dramatically. And using multiple aspects simultaneously is generally considered an integrated management approach, which is the ideal way to try to manage any pest you have to deal with. And on the mosquito side, there are numerous formulations of mosquito products for standing water bodies to treat larvae. So there's mosquito dunks, there's plunges, pouches, and mosquito bits, which are essentially small granular items that you can put in any standing water around the property. And again, you only really want to use these if it's standing water that you can't drain or just turn the container over or just replace the water in the container. Adult mosquitoes are considerably more difficult to control as they can fly. Adult control generally is considered your last ditch effort when you manage mosquitoes. It's much more efficient to try to manage the larva side of the mosquitoes, as they have generally concentrated water, standing water entities that they're breeding in. So if you can reduce your standing water and then treat those pockets of standing water that you can't manage alternatively, then you'll have to try to manage the adults with an application. And with those applications for adults, it's generally going to be a liquid application. Granular products really have a limited level of potential control on the adult mosquitoes. And another management style that generally is overlooked for adult mosquitoes in particular, which I use myself at home, is actually just oscillating fans. Mosquitoes themselves are relatively short-range flyers for most of the freshwater species. You're looking at maybe 100 to 150 meters maximum that they can realistically fly from the point that they hatched out. So most mosquito issues that are freshwater are localized around your home or the few areas surrounding you. So as they're relatively weak flyers, once you have an oscillating fan with a little bit of wind current, it'll generally do a very good job of keeping them out of the area. So that's just another non-pesticide approach to managing mosquitoes around the property. Okay, and we'll move on to questions from here.
Great, thanks, Moses. We had a few questions come in, and I'm sure as we're chatting here, some more will come in. The first one that came in was asking specifically about the connection between humidity and ticks. And Maybe you want to address this for the different species that people might find in the Northeast.
Sure. So humidity and ticks are linked directly. So it's a very, very targeted question. If you have consistent moisture in the general environment, you will have ticks present, especially in the Northeast area. If you, again, with consistent moisture, you're looking at deer ticks in particular. They need consistent moisture in that area to survive. And it can be anything from a freshwater pond to a downspout area on your property that consistently places the water from your roof, or it can be an irrigation system. So when you have those essentially permanent reservoirs of moisture, that's where the ticks will be located. Not only because it allows them to survive and quest for a longer period of time, but the host animals may also be attracted to that fresh water to drink it. So in areas where things tend to be dry, things like bird baths or irrigation systems will actually attract wildlife onto the property and allow new ticks to be dropped off. Now, for American dog ticks in particular, they can tolerate slightly drier areas. We generally find them in large grass areas or fields. So they're a little bit more resistant to desiccation, but again, they still need some sort of consistent moisture. If you do live in an area where you tend to see Lone Star ticks, they are very resistant to desiccation. So they will actively go out after a host on a parking lot, a blacktop parking lot in an 80-degree sunny day. I have videos of this from here on Long Island. And unfortunately, that species is fairly quick. They can go from your foot to your shoulder in less than a minute as an adult. So they're very rapid and aggressive feeders compared to the other species. So when we have to manage for Lone Star ticks on the property, we try to really reduce that level of humidity and moisture so that there's no areas that they can try to reside in when they need to rehydrate. So it's a very good question.
And a great answer, thanks. So it just addresses the complexity of the different tick species, and really there could be ticks anywhere in the yard, whether it's a little bit drier or good and moist for the black-legged tick. The second question that came in was, are there trees or shrubs that promote tick populations? And the person was specifically asking about barberry.
Yes. Barberry in particular, there's a lot of well-done studies that point out to the microclimate around the barberry plant itself and how the plant generally has an elevated level of relative humidity very close to the leaves as it respires water fairly rapidly through its normal processes. It actually allows the ticks to quest for a longer period of time on the vegetation itself because it has altered the microclimate around the plant. So on a normal day, say you have a normal environment, relative humidity of 50 or 60%. Right around that barberry, you could have relative humidity up in the 70 or 80 percentile. And just as an interesting side note, deer ticks in particular need a relative humidity of around 83% to not dehydrate or allow themselves to rehydrate. So anything below 83% actually decreases how long they can quest for. Now, if you are out in an environment that has 90% plus relative humidity, those ticks can functionally quest without dehydrating. So they can stay questing for significantly longer periods of time. And that's what we tend to see around thickets of Japanese barberry. And also many other invasive species that we tend to see, especially those that produce a berry or some type of edible product that can attract hosts. We will see elevated tick levels for pretty much every species across those plants as well. So for any of the invasives in Japanese barberry, it's really just another reason why we should look to using native alternative plants in our localized environment and see about removing some of those invasives from our naturalized areas if possible.
Great, thanks. The next question that came in was about screens and rain barrels. So most rain barrels have a screen over top that will collect some of the debris from the gutters. And the question was whether that will prevent mosquitoes from laying their eggs and successfully developing in that water.
So it's a trick question also. So yes, as long as the screen is fine enough where the adult mosquitoes themselves cannot fit through the screen and get in the container, they will attempt to lay eggs on the surface of that screen though. So if you ever come upon a point where that rain barrel fills up to the very top and touches the water, those eggs will hatch. So if you have an overflow on the top of the rain barrel, like many of them do, or some sort of shutoff, just so the water doesn't get up to the top of that screen, that will be your most effective way of stopping mosquitoes from getting into that water.
Excellent, thanks. So there are a bunch more questions that came in, and I might ask you, Moses, if you want to answer in the chat, or we'll try and take one more question. But any questions that don't get answered today, we'll have answered in the YouTube video description. The next question that I wanted to bring up is about pesticides and the products that you mentioned. And I do want to let people know that you should speak to someone from your particular state. If you're in a different state, you might want to speak to your cooperative extension to understand what products are available for use in your state. Registration can differ by state. So it's important to make sure that the products you're using and the use that you're going to use that product for are labeled in your state. So the question came up, can these products be used in flower beds? And are the chemicals dangerous to humans and other critters? And I think this refers to the mosquito treatments particularly.
To the granular products or the dunks?
I was imagining
yeah.
the liquid sprays.
Okay. So yeah, for the liquid applications, they, depending on the label, they may be allowed for flower beds, but generally on most pesticide labels in almost, well, many states, there is actually a section now for specific to pollinator protection. So many flowering plants, especially those that are known to be visited by pollinators of any type, you generally are not allowed to treat the actual flower blooms themselves on the plants. So when you are applying for mosquitoes, you do want to try to make sure you get fairly decent coverage on the interior part of the plant, especially in long grasses or other vegetation. But you do want to make sure that you're checking on the label of that product and make sure it may legally be applied to that ornamental setting. And some labels actually have specific species of plants that you may be allowed to apply them to. Depending on the type of pesticide product, there are some that have other plants are sensitive to. And for example, some of the 25B natural oil products on the market are known to unfortunately burn some plants when they're applied. So you need to keep an eye out on those and make sure you're checking with your local cooperative extension to see if any of that has been seen locally. But as far as health and safety goes of these products, anything with an EPA registration number has had a considerable amount of data collected on it as far as human health goes. So as long as any application is done following the manufacturer's label and any adjustments that your local state regulators have applied to that product, there generally is not anything to be concerned of for the products.
Great. Well, thanks again, Moses, for a great presentation and for taking the time to answer these questions. We're going to transition now to our IPM Minute, which is a related topic, and I will be presenting that today. So we're going to be talking about the myth of mosquito repelling plants. So perhaps in your garden centers or on social media, you might have come across an advertisement like this to go out and purchase some plants that will repel mosquitoes. In all of these cases, they're promoting 12 different plants. And Moses talked a little bit about this because all of these plants have essential oils that are thought to repel mosquitoes. So before we talk about the myth, I wanted to first talk a little bit about how repellents work. And it's kind of interesting to note that even though we've been using repellents for a long time, it's still an area of active research to understand the exact mechanism of how those products are working when we use them. So if we look at this section of the image here on the upper right, this is what we would consider a normal situation where human bodies or bodies of other animals are giving off human odors. That could be something that's secreted from our skin or something that we're breathing, like carbon dioxide. And biting arthropods like mosquitoes are attracted to those because it tells them that there's a host nearby. So when we use something like a synthetic repellent, things like DEET, picaridin, and IR3535, which was the active ingredient in the Skin So Soft line of products, what is thought to happen there is that those products mask the human odors. So the human odors would still be emitted, but the synthetic repellent is kind of preventing the mosquitoes from smelling the human. So they're just still flying around looking for that human scent. When it comes to natural repellents, things that are essential oil based and coming from plants, it's more of what we would consider an active repellent because those human odors are still being emitted, but the repellent itself is considered offensive by the insect and they want to get away. So based on that information, you can understand why people think that planting some of these different species in your garden would actually help protect you against mosquitoes. But it's really just a few essential oils that are concentrated from those plants that have some sort of repellency. So it isn't just having the plant, it's the process to concentrate the specific active ingredient, apply that to the skin that might have some repellent activity. So the reality of using plants as a repellent is that our research has shown that there's lots of chemicals in these plants that when they are applied directly to skin in lab settings, they can help deter mosquitoes. But just putting them in a garden pot or having them planted around your home isn't sufficient to repel these insects from finding and biting you. In this WebMD article, they specifically say that you can force the plant to release those chemicals by trimming them, crushing the leaves, or rubbing crushed leaves on your skin. But probably this would only provide maybe a minute or two of relief as these chemicals are not concentrated like those essential oils used in the tests. So what does work? Moses talked a lot about this, the protection against mosquitoes and prevention. The first thing that we could do is reduce mosquito habitat by eliminating the breeding sites, which contain standing water, or resting sites, such as vegetation. Vegetation that is close to your garden area or your home can allow mosquitoes that are night flying to hang out during the day and day flyers to hang out there overnight. So trimming that back and making it less accessible to mosquitoes is one way to reduce habitat. We can also dress appropriately if we're in a mosquito-rich environment, considering pants and long sleeves. And then we can use repellents on our skin. There's this great website by the EPA that helps you select the best repellent for you. Talks about the different active ingredients and where they fall on synthetic to natural, and then also how long those repellents might have a repellency effectiveness. So the ones that we talked about before, like DEET and picaridin, when they have a concentration of greater than 20%, that can provide 4 to 6 hours of protection against biting arthropods. So definitely check out the EPA's website to learn more about that. And the last thing that we can do, Moses suggested the use of oscillating fans, mosquitoes being weak flyers. That's a great approach. Or if you have the capability of screening in a certain area or using a screen house to enjoy the outdoors but not be bitten by these arthropods, that can work as well. We're at our 12:30 mark. So I will thank you all for attending and hope to see you at a future First Friday event. Have a great weekend.
Thank you, everybody.